Hello everyone, welcome back to Educately Geography. Today we're going to be talking about the agricultural revolution of the 1700s, so let's get started. Today's objectives, first we're just going to talk about life before the agricultural revolution. Then we're just going to highlight some important discoveries that happened during the actual revolution, and finally we're just going to discuss some long-term impact that this revolution had. So let's first start by talking about life before the agricultural revolution, specifically how farming worked. The vast majority of people during this time were farmers, especially during the Middle Ages and in the centuries afterwards, in the Renaissance and the 1600s. In most places, this number was well over 90%. Also, subsistence agriculture was common, and it was very frequent among peasants and other farmers. What that means is that peasants and farmers, they only grew what they themselves needed to survive and what their families needed to survive. They didn't really have any surplus of food that could go into, trading with other people or like making some sort of surplus profit that they could use to enter the consumer market. That wasn't really a thing beforehand. It was mostly just you grew what you needed to survive, and that's what they were only able to grow. Farming was done with very outdated methods, as you could imagine. First, they used an open 2 or 3 field crop system. What this meant is that they divided their lands. Often they had their sections of land were as a part of a communal village, plot. Even if they owned their own land, farmers would generally they would have divided their field into 2 or 3 sections, and every year they would choose one of them to just leave completely empty, so as to replenish the soil that's there, because over time the soil would degrade and then you can't grow as much crops on it or as many crops. So every year they would switch which field they would have that just completely empty so they could replenish it. Obviously, this wasn't a very efficient system, as they would come to learn. They didn't have any knowledge of selective breeding. So when later on we'll talk about how selective breeding influenced the agricultural revolution, but they didn't have any knowledge on how to use genetics to their advantage. They also didn't have many advanced tools. It was a very hand-led thing during life before the agricultural revolution. Obviously, they still had some tools to use, but farming before then was very inefficient. So what are some of the innovations that were made during the agricultural revolution? First, you had a new crop rotation system, or a way to organize your farmland. Instead of having the open field system, the new crop rotation system, it prevented excess land from laying fallow. And how did it do that? Well, instead of having one of your fields just lay empty, farmers, they now began to use certain root vegetables to replenish the soil while also giving them more food. A common example is a turnip, and so instead of just leaving a plot of land to lay empty, they would plant turnips there, which did a very good job replenishing some of the nutrients that were needed to grow stuff, while also serving as a food source for the farmers. Selective breeding was invented, or I guess found, during the agricultural revolution. It's considered a part of the one of the innovations that happened. This allowed farmers to choose favorable traits in their crops and, more importantly, arguably in their livestock. So now they could, for instance, you had cows. They could try breeding cows with other cows that made a lot of milk. So over time, they could gradually increase the efficiency of the animals that they were making products off of. You also had the inventions of certain tools. 2 examples are the seed drill, which did a very good job organizing seeds that went into the ground, made it very efficient. And then you also had another tool known as the horso, or the hoe plow. It has lots of different names. It was just a plow that loosened the soil, but it was driven by a horse instead of by a person. Both of these were invented by Jethro Tull, a very famous inventor during this time. And the gist of all of these tools is that they increased efficiency. That's the main takeaway. With pretty much everything here, just farming grew a lot more efficient. So what are some of the impacts that this agricultural revolution had? Well, first of all, population increased dramatically, as I imagine that you guys probably expected that. Because now, first of all, families can now support having more children, because now they had more food, and because they had this bigger, surplus of food, they could, they had the ability to feed their kids. Also, more kids survived later on because now they had access to food. Medical care was somewhat better now than it was in the past centuries. So now more people survived longer. That all those factors led to just more people being alive at a given time. The agricultural revolution, it indirectly forced people to actually leave the countryside for better opportunities in cities. There are a lot of reasons for this. One reason is, as you'd expect now, you have more people in the countryside. That kind of leaves less room for people to just continue farming because, first of all, everything's becoming more efficient now. So you kind of actually need or fewer farmers to even tend to the crops. But also now, if everyone's just like breeding in the countryside, now you have so many people just living there. There isn't really enough land for everyone. You can imagine that. There was also, specifically in Britain, there was also another thing that ties into this movement. It's known as they were known as the Enclosure Acts. The Enclosure Acts, basically, it was that private wealthy individuals, they began leasing and like owning their own private land. Beforehand, you had like communal lands in like villages that like everyone in a village would like farm on. But now private owners were just buying that land and kind of like preventing people from just using it as a communal plot where they could grow their own things. That made it so people, obviously, now they didn't have access to farmland. They didn't really have any other choice but to leave for better opportunities. And during the Industrial Revolution, where were those better opportunities? They were in cities where the factories were and other opportunities. The agricultural revolution also aided in making the farming industry as a whole larger in scale. This kind of ties into what I was talking about private investors and private owners just buying off communal land. Now they could grow their crops for their own benefit as opposed to just using it for subsistence farming, just to feed themselves and their families. These private owners, they had money. They would just grow crops on there. They would get some farmers that were already there to grow crops for them that they could largely use in a national or international market. This goes beyond just, growing things that you need to survive. So that does it for this video. Hopefully you learned some things about the agricultural revolution of the 1700s in Europe. We have plenty of other videos here on Educately, not only on geography, but about other subjects as well for middle school and honestly all students. But that does it for this video. So thank you for watching and have a nice day.